Hey, so we're back. Chapter 14 now. Remember, as of the last chapter, Saul was in trouble. And I mean trouble. Like, you don't get a king being surrounded by 3,000 men, 3,000 chariots, and 6,000 foot soldiers when you have 600. And it just doesn't get worse than that. And your priest, the one who connects you to God, has left you in the battlefield. He's gone home. So what happens now? In chapter 14, we continue. Seeing that only Saul and Jonathan had weapons, the Philistines were on chariots. I mean, I'm talking high-end weapons here and transportation. Now, the detachment of Philistines had gone out to the pass of Michmash. Yeah. One day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost." Now remember, this is not a battle of one day, so it's probably been a standoff for a while now. And Jonathan tells his servant. Remember, Jonathan is the one who caused all this. Well, if we were to put blame and pin it to somebody, we would say it was Jonathan's fault. What did he do? He attacked the Philistine outpost. Brave man, brave soldier. He goes and attacks the outpost, and the Philistines heard about it. All by himself he goes. And now again, he still has the adventurous idea to tell his servant, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father, the king, Saul. Now Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was a son of Ichabod's brother Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez and the other Sineh. One cliff stood to the north towards Michmash, the other to the south towards Gibeah. Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." "Do all you have in mind," his armor-bearer said. "Go ahead, I'm with you, heart and soul." Jonathan said, "Come on, then. We will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are, and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, "Come up to us, we'll teach you a lesson." So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and feet, with his armor-bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer followed and killed behind him. In the first attack, Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. Then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. Saul's outlooks at Gibeah in Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, "Muster the forces and see who has left us." When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor-bearer who were not there. Saul said to Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God." At that time it was with the Israelites. While Saul was talking to the priests, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So on that day the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on beyond Bethaven. Now the Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the troops tasted food. The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath, so he reached out the end of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, "Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, 'Cursed be anyone who eats food today.' That is why the men are faint." Jonathan said, "My father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted of this honey. A little of this honey. How much better it would have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater?" That day, after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Aijalon, they were exhausted. They pounced on the plunder, and taking sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them together with the blood. Then someone said to Saul, "Look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it." "You have broken faith," he said. "Roll a large stone over here at once." Then he said, "Go out among the men and tell them, 'Each of you bring your cattle and sheep and slaughter them here and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it.'" So everyone brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had done this. Saul said, "Let us go down and pursue the Philistines by night and plunder them till dawn. Let us not leave one of them alive." "Do whatever seems best to you," they replied. But the priest said, "Let us inquire of God here." So Saul asked God, "Shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand?" But God did not answer him that day. Saul therefore said, "Come here, all you who are leaders of the army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today. As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan, he must die." But not one of them said a word. Saul then said to all the Israelites, "You stand over here, stand over there. I and Jonathan my son will stand over here. Do what seems best to you," they replied. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, "The God of Israel, why have you not answered your servant today? If the fault is in me or my son Jonathan, respond with Urim. But if the men of Israel are at fault, respond with Thummim." Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and the men were cleared. Saul said, "Curse the Lord between me and Jonathan my son." And Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me, what have you done?" So Jonathan told him, "I tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die." Saul said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan." But the men said to Saul, "Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never! As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help." So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. Then Saul stopped pursuing the Philistines, and they withdrew to their own land. After Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies. On every side, Moab and the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered them. And Saul's sons were Jonathan, Ishvi, and Malchishua. The name of his older daughter was Merab, and that of the younger was Michal. His wife's name was Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimaaz. The name of the commander of Saul's army was Abner, son of Ner, and Ner was Saul's uncle. Saul's father Kish and Abner's father Ner were sons of Abiel. All the days of Saul there was bitter war with Philistines, and whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him in his service. It's a long chapter there, and we see that finally there is rescue from the Lord himself. In the last session, it would have been difficult to imagine what on earth Saul was going to do with all the men scattered in caves and all sorts of places in fear. But look what the Lord does. He actually sends help from above by causing a fear. I love it. It says that then in verse 15, panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. God sent help. He rescued the Israelites. Why do we see that? It says in the Bible that down in verse 22, well, down in my Bible, when all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So on that day the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on beyond Bethaven. So even the sacrifice was no longer relevant, because they had brought over the ark, and Saul wanted to find out or inquire of the Lord whether they should go to battle and all that, but he had already moved in, and there was so much havoc in the Philistines' camp. In verse 19 it says, while Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously... Yes, we've read that. So the Lord rescues his people, and we find that even in our day-to-day, sometimes we mess up pretty seriously, and the Lord shows up in mercy. I must not forget the mercy of the Lord is there. It's part of who he is. He stands alongside and beside his children when they call out in distress. But look at the faith that preceded this slaughter and this panic caused by God. Jonathan and his servant, remember Jonathan, the adventurous one, goes and they show up at the camp of the enemy, just the two of them, him and his armor bearer, and they say, look, if they tell us, come up here, we will know that this is a sign that the Lord has given them to us. And that's exactly what happened. They got their sign and they started to fight, and the armor bearer falling in place behind him, and they killed some Philistines right from the word go. And the Philistines said, the Hebrews are crawling out of their holes they were hiding in. Very arrogant, right? The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and the armor bearer, come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson, not knowing that is the code word for we got you now. So Jonathan and said to his armor bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and feet, with his armor bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed, killed behind him. In the first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. And that was the first onslaught. And the very next verse says, "Then panic struck." So sometimes you have to make the move. Sometimes you just have to make the move. You have to make the move by faith. And we see, if it wasn't Jonathan's bravery really and courage, he wouldn't have seen the kind of onslaught that happened and the victory that the Israelites had. He had to make that move, and boldly in faith, and that is why the Lord came up and showed up. The Lord will always show up for a man acting in faith, knowing that they have no other respite besides the Lord. There was no hope for them. They would have been killed, butchered, really mercilessly, and tortured, because the Philistines loved to torture. Remember the story of Samson, the gouging out of their eyes. They loved to torture. It could have happened to them, but because Jonathan decided to make that move and say, if they agree to let us come up, then the Lord will be on our side. And they got their sign. Isn't that quite some faith? Some bravery, right? And they were prepared for battle. And his armor bearer acts as his partner. We need partners. We need alliances. We need strategic alliances. We need people that got our back, literally. He fell behind him. It says, Jonathan and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. Got your back. So we see now a scenario playing out at the same time that all this battle is happening. Saul, meanwhile, had given an oath, and he had said that if anybody eats, then they'll be cursed. And Jonathan, busy on his adventure, killing and getting rid of the Philistines, didn't know. So was this a good move during battle to tell your men not to eat? I don't get that. I don't think it was a very good decision. And we see that the men of Saul were used to him doing whatever he wanted to do, because they keep replying, do whatever seems best to you. And again, that is when Saul says in verse 36, "Let us go down and pursue the Philistines by night and plunder them till dawn, and let us not leave one of them alive." And they say, "Do whatever seems best to you." And then he says later on in verse 40, "Saul then said to all the Israelites, you stand over there. I and Jonathan, my son, will stand over here. Do whatever seems best to you." I mean, Saul just I think he was just those leaders who do whatever they want to do. And the followers' attitude, you can see that. They're like, do whatever you want to do. Until he vows to kill Jonathan. And of course, it doesn't make sense at all. It's really irrational. Second time counting, because the first one was when he goes out and tells them not to eat. And yet they're in battle. So Jonathan says in verse 29, "My father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey." Look at that. He says, my father has made trouble for this country. For the country. How much better would it have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from the enemies? Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater? It wasn't a wise decision when we or our leaders make wrong decisions. So Jonathan comes in the moment of his fate. He says, Saul said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die." Really? Okay. But the men said to Saul, "Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall onto the ground, for he did this today with God's help." Now Saul is thoroughly oblivious of the fact that his son brought this victory with the help of God, but it was his initiative. Isn't that interesting? When your own father does not give you credit for what you've done for him. Because Jonathan was working for Saul. Essentially, they were working towards protecting the same kingdom. And Saul is ready to kill his own son because of a vow he made, because somebody crossed his authority. Somebody did against what he had decreed, and it was going to cost him his life. So that the people stood between Saul and his own son. And then Saul stopped. It says, so the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. Remember, God had not said that he would be put to death. And it was Saul's decision for the men not to eat anything. But that vow, that rash and irrational vow cost them, because the Lord did not respond to them, did not respond to Saul when they needed him. Could we have done something or said something that is stopping us from hearing from God? And we need to clear it out of the way first before we can hear again? It happens. So after Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side. The Ammonites in Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered them, which is very noble. Well, at least we get to know more about Saul and the decisions, his way of leadership, and we can definitely relate to that. There are some people who are totally authoritarian. You do not do what they tell you to do. But we also have very valiant soldiers in our lives, and maybe we should be more deliberate about protecting them and celebrating them, the Jonathans of this world who go ahead and secure the victory in the battle way before anybody else has the guts to get out of the cave. And we see a valiant armor-bearer falling behind him. It's interesting. And the characters of the soldiers coming together to protect Jonathan. We can learn a lot from everybody. But at the end of the day, the Lord, God, saved Israel. See you next time for chapter 15.